of Psalms. We're on Psalm 3 today, but before we delve into the third Psalm, I wanted to go back and mention something that I didn't, because we kind of delved straight into the first Psalm when we started this study. We didn't really do an introduction to the book like we often do when we start a new class, but I just wanted to mention this because some Bibles have this, others do not. The one I typically use does not, and part of the reason I hadn't thought to include it until today. But Psalms is divided into 5 books. And sometimes in some Bibles it'll say like book 1 at the beginning, and then book 2, 3, 4, 5. But again, I think most don't. But book 1 is Psalms 1 through 41. And most of the Psalms attributed to David are in this collection. The second book, chapters 42 to 72, which contains some Psalms of Korah and Asaph. Book 3, Psalms 73 to 89, which are almost exclusively the Psalms of Korah and Asaph. Book 4, Psalms 90 to 106, which are mostly untitled, or not attributed to anyone. And then Psalms 107 to 150, which are mostly liturgical psalms for pilgrimages to the temple and for festivals. So not exclusively. It's kind of like Proverbs, if you recall. When we discussed Proverbs some time ago, Proverbs is also divided into several subsections, which generally tend to follow a certain way, but not 100%. Psalms is the same way. So just as perhaps a matter of curiosity, I wanted to note that, especially if you happen to have a Bible that does note those differences, and you may have been wondering what they are and why I didn't mention it. I wanted to note it. As to when that happened, we don't know, but generally believed to be a Jewish rabbinic tradition. The Psalms were collected, and actually we have a bit more to say about that with the third Psalm, because we noticed 2 new things with Psalm 3 that we didn't have with the first 2. First of all, Psalm 3 is the first where we find a superscript or a superscription, which reads, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. Okay, so some psalms have superscript, others don't. Again, the first 2 did not have them. These generally tend to attribute authorship. Sometimes they'll include Hebrew words that have to do with instruction for how the psalm is to be read or sung. Sometimes, as is in the case with this one, it'll even give an occasion for when the psalm was composed. So this one is David's flight from Absalom, his son. You'll find quite a few psalms that are when David is on the run from Saul, when King Saul sought to take his life. Again, take the superscripts with a grain of salt. Just like that division of Psalms into 5 books, the superscripts are not original. They were added later, again, Jewish rabbinic traditions. How much later, we're not entirely sure, but they're definitely not original. So these are oftentimes, they're traditionally attributed many times to David, which stands to reason. David was certainly noted to be a talented musician, a writer of psalms, just as Solomon is noted to be one who gave many Proverbs. So it certainly makes sense. And I don't know that there's a great reason to doubt that these are indeed composed by David, but just kind of bear that in mind. Take the superscripts with a grain of salt. Another thing, the second thing that we see for the first time in Psalm 3, if you look at the end of verse 2, there's this odd word, S-E-L-A-H, Selah. What does that mean? The short answer is no one knows. Its exact meaning is lost to the mists of time, but it's generally believed to be, and again, stands to reason, generally believed to be a word that has to do with the reading or the singing of the psalm, most everything I've consulted says that it's a word that likely indicates a rest or a pause, as the psalm is being read or sung. And you'll see it a lot. You'll see it in a number of psalms as we work our way through. More than once even here in Psalm 3, you see it in Psalm 4, so you'll see it a lot. Again, what exactly does it mean? No one knows, but it's generally accepted to be a pause or a rest. All right, so Psalm 3, a handy outline that kind of serves to break it down a bit. This one handily alliterated with the letter C. So in the first two verses, we find calamity. Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God. So we have the psalmist in calamity and in trouble. Verses 3 and 4, confidence. But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head. I cry unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. So despite the calamity, the psalmist expresses confidence in God. Verses 5 and 6, courage. I laid me down and slept. I awake, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about. So we have confidence on the psalmist part, courage certainly as well. Verse 7, a call to action. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone, thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. And then finally, verse 8, comfort. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord, thy blessing is upon thy people. Okay, so the calamity of the first two verses. The psalmist notes, how are mine enemies increased? Suggesting that initially the number of people arrayed against him were perhaps few in number, but it's certainly grown. So suggesting that, not just more than one person who wishes him harm, but it would seem to be a multitude of people who have set themselves against him. And certainly, if the superscript is correct, and this is composed by David while fleeing from his son Absalom, that certainly fits. 2 Samuel 15, 1 through 6, you certainly get a sense of how Absalom had turned the people against David. And not only was it Absalom, so you had Absalom who rebelled against his father and generally drew the people after him, largely by telling them what they wanted to hear and appealing to their vanity. But he also had the abandonment of Ahithophel, a close counselor, a number of his generals, some of his best soldiers who deserted David in that time. So you not only had this rebellion led by his son in a political and a violent sense, but also some of the other people who were closest to him, who betrayed him, and certainly he felt that mightily. So these people who were troubling him, who were rising up against him, close friends and family, amongst others. Verse 2, it's evident that this enemy, these who were troubling him, who were rising up against him, are confident that God is on their side. Okay, God is not going to preserve David's life. And if you go to 2 Samuel 17, 1 through 4, you find one example there of how that kind of attitude might have prevailed against David's enemy, or among David's enemy, right? How they might have thought that God was on their side. And that's often the case, is it not? That when good men are in such trials, it would seem to others, certainly, that they have been forsaken by God. They've been abandoned. Oftentimes it really does seem that God is on the side of those who were vexing, troubling rising up against good people. Again, traditionally on this occasion, David himself. And yet, despite that, despite the calamity, despite the trouble, again, despite the fact, verse 2, that it would seem to be the case, at least among his enemies, if not to some casual third-party observer, that they're going to carry the day. David's going to lose this. He expresses confidence. Verse 3 starts with one of my favorite words, certainly a consequential one, but I've noted many, many times, those of you who have been following along in these studies for some time know, I like to call attention to the words but and if, because they're both very small, but if and so. Those three very, very small words have tremendous importance. And as we always say, the effective meaning, the functional meaning of the word but, B-U-T, is ignore whatever was just said, right? A contrast is being drawn. So, the psalmist is in dire straits. It would seem to be the case that he's bound and destined to lose, but forget that. Forget the trouble. Forget the fact that the odds are stacked against him. He has tremendous confidence. Spurgeon, who wrote a great deal about the Psalms many years ago, and Brother Wakehaster is a fan of using some of his material, pointed out that in the original language, the word here that's translated shield has more of the meaning of a buckler that completely surrounds the individual, right? So certainly a shield fits, right? As you're reading the thought here, but it's more than that. It's a sense of 360-degree protection, and the kind of confidence that comes with that. The psalmist points out that he would cry unto Jehovah with his voice. I cried unto the Lord with my voice. He heard me out of his holy hill. This crying out, of course, is calling for help, right? That's what he's crying for. He cried unto the Lord with his voice, help me. I'm in a bad situation. I need help. Which suggests that he recognizes where to turn for help. Right? I mean, that's kind of the first thing to note about this. He knows to whom he ought to call out. A lot of people wouldn't even go there, or wouldn't think to start there. I dare say a lot of people, really bad situation, they may call out to God, as the psalmist is doing here, but oftentimes it isn't going to be the first place they turn. But David, in this situation, turns to the Lord as a shield for him, his glory, the lifter up of his head. So he knows where to turn for help. He recognizes his inability to overcome in and of himself. So he understands that he's in dire straits, he's in a bad situation, he needs help. And so he seeks that help from God, which is something that is characteristic of David. We find thoughts very similar to this in many of the Psalms that are attributed to David, and others as well, but particularly those that are attributed to David. We find him turning to God for help, whether it's on the run from Absalom, on the run from Saul, these terrible situations. And you find language like this. God is his shield, his glory, the lifter up of his head, his tower, his refuge, his rock. Very, very common. So, how does God react? He answers me out of his holy hill. So God answers prayer. Also, God is interested in the individual person. Right? So not only does God answer prayers, but God hears my prayers. Right? On this occasion, he hears David's prayer. In spite of my imperfections, my weaknesses, and God's holiness, the fact that he is in heaven and I'm upon the earth, despite those things, he is willing to listen and to respond. Verses 5 and 6, the psalmist speaks of the tremendous courage that he has. Verse 5, I laid me down and slept. Have you ever been in a really, really bad situation, under tremendous stress, perhaps facing overwhelming difficulty, overwhelming odds, you know how difficult it is just to find a passing peace of mind in a time like that. Much less to be able to lay down and go to sleep. And yet that's the kind of courage, the kind of confidence that David has. Despite the fact that his enemies are all around him, they're increased against him, rising up against him. They're convinced that there's no help for him to be found from God. Yet he is going to be able even to sleep in it, knowing that the Lord will sustain him. He's not afraid of 10,000 men, even though they've set themselves around about him. He's completely surrounded by people that want to take his life, but he isn't afraid. That is the kind of courage that even in this situation he's able to project and to have. Verse 7, a call to action. Right? O Lord, save me, O my God. Thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. That language there. We haven't talked about this yet because we haven't come to an example of it, but there's a bit of what's called an imprecatory thought here. There are a number of psalms that are known as imprecatory psalms, and I guess typically, at least I do this. I think most people probably do. When you think about the psalms, you tend to think of psalms that express praise toward God, that people tend to turn to for comfort. Right? You think of the 23rd Psalm, perhaps most famously in that respect. You tend to think of the Psalms as things that are comforting, that are uplifting. Imprecatory Psalms are those that are calling out for God's vengeance, usually in a very violent and graphic manner, against one's enemies. There are a number of them. You can't help but note it when we eventually come to one. But you find that thought here in verse 7. Right? God has smitten on mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly. Generally speaking, talking about God's power to overcome the enemy. Right? These men who have arrayed themselves against David, who are troubling him, surrounding him all about. He knows that God is going to be victorious. He's going to overcome his enemies. And again, calling upon God to do that. And then a word of comfort in verse 8, kind of contrasting a bit with the imprecatory nature of verse 7. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people. Okay. And two, it's worth noting here, not only are the psalmist's thoughts and concerns upon himself and his own situation, yet again, if this is indeed written by David when he's on the run from Absalom, he's out in the wilderness, not completely alone, because there are some who go with David. But by and large, they've been forsaken by certainly the majority of the people who followed after Absalom. They're kind of out there in the wilderness on their own. It would be easy in that situation for David to be concerned only for himself. Again, a bad situation in which his closest family and friends have turned on him. They've betrayed him. And yet, here at the conclusion of this psalm, thy blessing is upon thy people. Again, many of whom have turned on him. When he says upon thy people, understand a lot of these people, all of God's people, are the very same who were troubling him, who were rising up against him. Verse 1, who have set themselves round about. Verse 6. I think it says a tremendous amount about the heart of David. David is called a man after God's own heart. And sometimes when you see a psalm like this attributed to him, you catch a glimpse of it. Despite all of his many, many problems and shortcomings, which we've discussed before in sermons and class settings, despite those things, you see just in this short psalm the kind of confidence that he has, the courage that he has in light of that confidence, And then here in verse 8, the concern for his fellow Israelites, God's people, despite the situation at hand. So with all that in mind, what are some things we can take from this? Some lessons, some applications? Well, for one thing, God's people are going to have enemies. Okay, David, despite being a good man, again, a man after God's own heart, again, despite his shortcomings, being God's anointed, being a very popular and successful king. This is one thing when I think about Absalom's rebellion that astonishes me somewhat. How was Absalom able to draw the people away from David's, David is the one who had slain Goliath. He had expanded Israel's territory far beyond what it had been. He was a very popular, very successful king, and yet he had enemies. Certainly his own son Absalom, some of the counselors and generals who aligned themselves with him, but then amongst the people too. There's always going to be enemies. The Lord himself, Jesus, had more than his fair share. We just spent some time working our way through the book of John. You find it there in Matthew, Mark, and Luke as well. Plenty of people who wished him absolutely nothing but evil. And he promises the same for those who follow him, does he not? John 15, he has that discussion with the apostles on his final night. God's people are going to suffer persecution. There's going to be no shortage of enemies. That's bound to happen. You might note 2 Timothy 3:12, all who live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. Right? So there's something in this psalm here perhaps for us. People who trouble us, people who rise up against us, it's going to happen. Hopefully not in quite as literal a way as it did for David, but you never know. It could. But even if it doesn't, there are other ways in which we are troubled if we're going to be faithful. So God's people have enemies. Number 2, in times of trouble, don't forget to pray. God will lift up our heads, answer us out of his holy hill. Again, David's first course of action, not his last. So let's take that lesson to heart as well. 3, Christians should be, as Brother Waycaster puts it here, realistically optimistic when it comes to assessing the enemy, right? Those who trouble us in this life as God's people. You can go to one extreme and refuse to recognize the enemy, refuse to be informed. That is to kind of stick your head in the sand and just pretend that it isn't even there, that people aren't hostile toward you because of your faithfulness. But on the other extreme, if you look at it on a spectrum, at the other extreme, you fix your eyes on the enemy and you become overwhelmed with dread, with fear, and you forget who it is that is on our side. All right, David certainly has not done that. David realizes that the enemy is there. Kind of hard not to when they're troubling and rising up against you, but it's possible. It's possible. But he doesn't allow himself to become overwhelmed, to become filled with dread and fear, because he knows that God is on his side. Again, if you're looking for an application from this psalm, that's something that certainly applies to us as well. And then also from the very last verse, something that takes on, I think, certainly a different shade of meaning for us living under the New Testament than perhaps it would in David's day. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Salvation belongs unto the Lord. Of course, taking this in a New Testament context, understanding that the gospel, as Paul puts it, is God's power unto salvation, to the Jew person, also to the Greek. It is exclusively his. He offers it by way of the gospel, and it's incumbent upon each and every person who hears the gospel to decide, how am I going to respond to it? But certainly, I think Paul would be the first to remind us of the fact that it is God's to extend. It is God's to offer. So that is the third psalm. We will pick up, Lord willing, next week with number 4. Thank you all very much for your attention today.
Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? Over every thought, over every word, may my life reflect the beauty of my Lord. 'Cause you mean more to me than any earth